this has started this session as part of the International Center for Coaching Supervision supervision training, because we have 3 sessions there on working with groups. And we do cover some group dynamics. There's some, heavy psychodynamic stuff, but there's also a practical session. And as I prepared for that session the first time, I just came up with a list of 30 things that are quite practical and quite helpful. And I never get to talk about even a fraction of that. So I figured when Joan asked me, hey, do you want to do something for the alumni? I figured, let's do the extension of that session. And let's just share what I know and what I've learned. There's 1,000 ways to work with groups, but I'll hope there's something in there for you. And if you want to clarify, ask something, please do. If you want to share your experience of working with groups, also, please feel free to contribute. Anybody who knows me knows I love having conversations. So feel free to interrupt me or put something in the chat. And then we can hopefully get as much as possible from this. Right. Ready? Good. So what do I know? I can't help it. I'm a dad now. I love a good pun. So I've been running groups for, I think, about 4 or 5 years now. There's a dozen at the moment. And I've learned a lot. I don't run groups anymore the way that I started, right? So these things evolve. And I guess that is my first kind of encouragement for people is just get started, right? No group will be perfect. And the way that you run groups in a couple of years is probably not going to be the way that you run groups now. So I guess that's also my kind of first point. When I started running groups, I figured I'd just go for it now, because I got kind of lost in how am I going to do it? What's the best way to do it? And at some point I decided I'm just going to do it now. I'm just going to put a word out. And if nobody signs up, I don't run any groups until somebody does. And if one person signs up, then I run a group with them and me, and I guess they get one-to-one supervision for the price of group supervision. So are they really going to complain about that? Well, maybe, but if that's not okay, that's okay. I'll wait for somebody to sign up for whom that's not an issue. My experience was that's never an issue, right? So I figured if I get more than 4 people, I'll start a new group. So just getting started like that helps. If you just want to try it out, it's easy to find people who are up for a low cost or no cost experiment, right? So whether that's coaching groups or supervision groups, just get the word out and see if anybody's up for it. Chances are that people would like to be part of a group. There's 10,000 new coaches every year, I've just read in a recent article from Jonathan Passmore. And that's only the people who get trained as coaches. So there's a ton of coaches out there who are not registered by these kind of things. Not everybody believes in supervision, but everybody who is a trained coach from recent years is probably aware that supervision exists and generally that it's a good idea. So if you ask coaches, I haven't met anybody who disagrees with supervision, right? Maybe they had a bad experience, but in general, it's difficult to disagree with the concept. But as coaches are starting out, they might not have the funds to invest in their own supervision because they're still struggling to make their own business work, which is something that I appreciate. So if you're offering free groups, it's an easy one to say yes to, especially if you frame it as an experiment of some sort. And I think there's no shame in experiments, right? If you're still learning this, if you're still trying something out, and that's why they're low cost or no cost or reduced cost, then I think we can take the pressure off us. Right? I was asked about taster sessions. Do you offer taster sessions? Or I've had clients asking, hey, could I try one out and then make a decision? And that's really tricky because when somebody joins a group, imagine you sign up 4 people and then 2 of them decide not to go for it. And then you do all the contracting and introductions in the first session. I'll say a bit more about that later. And then 2 people drop off again. It's really quite disruptive. It doesn't quite work in my experience, right? So this is where it can get a little tricky, right? Because what do you do with that? How can somebody feel confident to go for a supervision group if they don't know who they are going to be meeting? So I've experimented in the past with having a short questionnaire. I'll tell you a little bit about that too, where I just check for 3 general aspects. I check for experience, more or less, right? Because very experienced coaches tend to have different kind of questions than very new coaches. So roughly match people by experience helps. Logistics is, it's like herding cats, herding squirrels is sometimes what I refer to. So getting especially busy, experienced coaches in the same room together once a month, once a quarter, whatever the frequency is, at the same time on a regular date can be tricky, right? So structure matters, but I check generally. I had good experience with having set slots already in my calendar. So I started with every 4th Friday. I figured it's a nice alliteration. It's easy to remember. 4th Friday sounded kind of powerful. So I figured 4th Friday, you could book it into the Google Calendar as a 4th Friday, every 4th Friday. That was great. Only then later I realized that every 4th Friday is not necessarily the last Friday. Some months have 5 Fridays. And so then it got really confusing. So now all my supervision groups are on the last week and the first week of the month. Right? Because it turns out that the 4th Thursday is not always the day before the 4th Friday. So you see how complicated and complex it gets. So having a clear date and a regular date or set dates beforehand really works. So people know what they can say yes to. And that's helpful. If you offer too many dates, chances are it gets lost. I once had 12 people interested in joining a group and no group has come to fruition because I offered way too many dates and then it was all spread across and it didn't work out and then it took too long. It was a mess, right? So now I offer 2 or 3 slots if I have plenty of people who want to join a group. But generally, I ask for experience, I ask for logistics, when are they available, and I ask for a focus of the session, right? So for example, I have a group for positive psychology coaches. I have a group for existential coaches. I have a group for coaches who work integratively with some therapy inside, right? I offer a group for group coaches. So there's different focus of the group, and some coaches would want to join a group that has a particular focus. They want to be surrounded with like-minded coaches. That helps, right? Diversity is helpful because we can learn from very different styles. So as long my experience is that as long as they're aligned in terms of experience a little bit and in terms of logistics, then the focus of the group doesn't matter so much as long as people understand and you've contracted and they agreed that they're here for a mixed group, right? And lots of learning in there. But there's also benefits of people who come together around a particular theoretical lens, such as, Gestalt or psychodynamic coaching, because then they're with colleagues in the same kind of mindset with the similar assumptions. That can be quite helpful. But taster sessions that don't work for me, right? Because so I tell you all about the kind of filtering or screening system. I have a short, after that questionnaire, I have a short 30-minute call. I try to make it shorter, but 30 minutes about works for me, just to make a connection, tell them a bit about the group, check those 3 aspects, and listen to my gut instinct, right? That's something I had to learn, but I learned to trust that. But with those information combined with how I feel about this person, and do I feel they're a good fit for the other people that I know are in the group, then on that basis, you can make a decision to invite somebody into a group or create a new one. Right? And that's worked kind of well for me. Generally, think about, by the way, this is for coaching. It's the same thing. And I think even more complex in coaching. I don't run any coaching groups because for me, I find it really difficult because my clients are very diverse. The existential coaching lens that I bring is quite diverse. So people don't really gather around the same sort of thing. But when they do, and often they really can, it really works for coaching groups as well, not just supervision groups. So for example, career transitions can have very different, similar parallels. Or when you have a coaching group around self-confidence, they might need to go in very different directions as they're presenting. But if it's grouped around the same theme, You know, when you work with teams, that's a group that has a common shared purpose. Then it really works quite well to group people around the same focus, around the same goal, around the same theme. But have a think about logistics. How are you going to run these groups? How do you get people to sign up, for example? In the beginning, I didn't use anything, right? I sent invoices out manually. I chased them manually. I grouped people manually. Over time, I've added, for example, this Google form. It's not something that I started out with. It was all manual, and it worked for the first 3 groups or so. After the 4th or 5th one, I realized this is not sustainable. It takes a lot of time to send people individual invites and invoices. Then I struggled at times with reminders, right? Do I send out a reminder before? It's helpful if you have some system set up where people get a reminder that the session is coming up, for example. I still use Google Calendar for my group invites just because the Satori, the coaching system that I'm using, is not up to speed in terms of functionality of putting in groups. Initially, it didn't work to put every last Friday in, for example. So depending on your calendar system, have a little think about, do you already use a coaching system or a booking system of some sort? Does it have a group functionality? How often do these group meet? Is it once a month? Mine meet once a month with 4 people. You might offer group supervision every 2nd month or maybe every quarter. For how long do these sessions last? My sessions, because there's 4 people, I like the intimacy of 4 people. At a certain size of group, it's more difficult to feel safe in a group, right? So the larger the group gets, the less safe it feels generally. In supervision, particularly in coaching also, it's important that people feel that they can make mistakes and they can show up real and they can share what they've screwed up and where they feel unsure. If you have too many coaches watching, especially if they don't really know each other, it gets tricky, right? So I decided that my supervision groups are 4 people and that they commit to be together I started with 3 months, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But given that we introduce each other, we form as a group, and it's the same people who come every time, the longer the groups stay together, the stronger they work. Right? I'm probably going to start some drop-in sessions soon because I really like the format, and some coaches just come because they have something to share and it just got difficult. They just want some space to talk about it. That's fine also. I like groups that are recurring.
Hello, Yannick.
Yeah.
Sorry to disturb you.
All
have
good.
you started recording?
Yes.
Okay. Fine.
I should. Pause recording, stop recording. Yes. Yeah, that's running.
Okay.
Good. So drop-in sessions also work, but there is a safety thing, right? So I like smaller groups, and I like that they meet regularly because the longer they're together, the better they work together. Where do I want to go next? Well, let's see. Waiting list. How do you start getting a group together, right? I have because I use this Google form, I don't always have a suitable group for somebody who wants to join a group. So that's where a waiting list comes in. When somebody, I used to do it quite well, and I would like to go back to it if my life wasn't so hectic at the moment, that I recruit twice a year for groups. And then I say all groups that currently have spaces available are open. Once I start a group, then the group stays closed for at least a couple of months, even if I have somebody who I think would be a really suitable addition. Reason being that I like the group to form. We spend almost the whole first session getting to know each other, contracting. There might be time for a slot of supervision, but really it's about the group forming and getting to know each other and getting accustomed to each other. It's really helpful. So I started groups when I have at least 2 people in the group. For me, 3 is a party, right? So 3 is a group. I'm happy to start that. You need to make a decision whether it's worthwhile. Depends on how much you charge. Depends on a couple of other factors. But for me, I was happy to start But given that the group would then be closed, I needed to make that decision, right? You might want to start with 6 or with 4, and you don't start until you have that number together. A colleague of mine said, it was Sivash, my podcast partner. He said he saw groups where the supervisor would start or the coach would start with even one person, and then they would get one-to-one work until the next person joins. And it was like, well, we're going to start working together, but the group is going to start 6 months from now or 3 months from now. And I'm going to do however weekly, monthly sessions until that date. And at that date, the group would be closed for a year, right? So that would allow them to already build a relationship, to already start working and not have people on a waiting list for a long time. They would get value straight away. A bit tricky because then relationships start forming before other people come in. I like bringing people together and starting from that scratch. But then ultimately, there's always a bit of coming and going, right? So, supervision groups have their half-lives. Every group has their half-life. So it works for a certain amount of time. And at some point, the group might no longer serve you for whatever reason, right? Nothing has to go wrong. Maybe you just want to work with a different supervisor or with a different coach. You know, maybe you just want to change an energy. That's absolutely fine. I run a waiting list, but I don't start with that. But when somebody leaves a group, there might be a new person coming into the group anyway. That means that there will be existing relationship, and that's something we just need to manage, right? 4 people in a group, 1 person leaves, another one comes in, it's a new group. Even though 3 people know each other already and may know a lot about each other, there's a 4th person coming in. I thought it was going to be much more difficult than it really was in the end. You know, every time a new person joined, it was a pretty smooth experience. You know, we need to reiterate the contract. You know, there needs to be another session where people introduce each other. It's actually quite a good exercise to introduce yourself for the, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th time. Because every time you introduce yourself to another coach or another colleague, you get to practice your pitch in a way, right? So you can frame these things in a way that's valuable. Making decisions around online groups or physical groups. I have not run physical groups. I would love to. It just wasn't really feasible. In the beginning, just where I lived wasn't feasible. There wasn't enough space to put 4 or 5 people in a room together comfortably. And then it's much harder to recruit people that are in a similar space of experience and available at similar times. Logistics are already difficult. So getting people into a physical space, if you have that opportunity, wow, amazing, great, do it. But online tends to be a lot easier. There are some things to consider in terms of how you facilitate, right? So you can make eye contact with everybody at the same time, but you can't really do this body-led facilitation, right? So you're restricted in how you facilitate groups. And when you work with groups, my experience, it's more impactful how you hold yourself in a space, because you can pick up on group dynamics and you can have more opportunities to facilitate just by looking at people individually, so you don't have that online. So benefits and pitfalls, right? Some pros, some cons. Have a little think about whether you want to run groups online or in the same space together. I'll pause there for a moment and see if there's questions or, well, clarifications, right? I have about another 10, 15 points, but just clarifications on the things I've already talked about. And I might not see you, so feel free to speak or put your digital hand up, which means I think you can pop into the top of my list. Yes, Julia.
Hi, mine is a super simple question, and that is, when you're talking numbers of the group, so you're saying a group of 4, are you including yourself in that 4?
No, that's 4 plus me. Oh, and good that you ask, because the reason I hadn't explained, my groups are 90 minutes. And I didn't want someone to not get to present a case 2 months in a row, right? So if there's 4 people, 90 minutes, that's 2 half-hour slots. Half-hour slots work really well for me. because it's an appropriate time to get into some depth. I've tried 20 minutes, I've tried longer. Half an hour is a really good time for a supervision slot. So that leaves a bit of time in the beginning to check in, leaves a bit of time in the end to kind of work with our dynamics, check into interesting moments, figure out whether the next session works in terms of timing. So 2 half-hour slots and a bit of time at the beginning and at the end. And that's why it's 4. That's pretty simple. You know, you can do 6 and do 2-hour slots, 2-hour sessions, for example.
Brilliant, thank you.
Cool. Okay, move on. By the way, I appreciate I'm talking quite fast and I'm touching on a lot of topics, sometimes at the same time. For example, numbers I already talked about. So if you want me to slow down, let me know. If not, I hope I'll just throw a bunch of stuff at you and then we can see at the end where we need to stop and pause. Yeah, Rebecca.
Hi, Yannick. Sorry I can't be on camera. I've got a baby here asleep. Just wanted to ask a question in terms of, you know, when you facilitate the groups, how do you decide on who goes and who brings a case for that particular session?
Yeah, I'll talk about that for sure.
Perfect. Thank you.
Did talk about focus, right? It's helpful to have diverse coaches in the group, but it also helps for them to be really aligned. So I don't think there's a better or worse. It's just a decision that you need to make before so that you can contract around it, right? Regardless of whether you put people together with the same focus or whether you make a decision to keep it quite diverse. The important thing is that people who enter the group are aware of that before they enter, right? Because I mentioned, I ask people, and I think, is that the next one, commitment? No, not yet. But we can go there now. So I used to ask people to commit for 3 months, and I still do that. 3 months is my minimum commitment. Reason being that the first session will be a bit different because I mentioned, you know, we introduce each other, etc., contracting. The second session will be like a normal session would go in terms of structure. I do a structure of, you know, check in, 2 slots, check out, more or less, right? What was I? I lost my train of thought. Can somebody help me out?
Commitment.
Commitment. Thank you. So the second session will be more like a normal session, and we would check in, right? What's that like for you? What can we do more of, less of, differently? How's it working? Do you getting what you need, right? So after the third session, you know whether that group really doesn't work for you or whether you can make it work for yourself. So I ask for 3 months minimum commitment, so 3 session commitment, and to pay that in advance as a sign of that commitment, you know, because then they're invested in making this group work rather than just saying, nah, this is difficult and I don't want to have a difficult, awkward conversation. So after 3 months, you know, sometimes somebody just really triggers you all the time. And it's, yes, you could probably make it work in some way. And I think there's always something to learn if somebody really triggers you in that way. But maybe it just doesn't work. Maybe it's easier to just choose a path of less resistance, right? Maybe just choose a group that would work for you much easier, where you resonate a lot more. But I think 3 sessions is give it a good try, right? And when there's some conflict, but there's a deep ground for learning. So now, because there was a bit of coming and going and quite a few people after 3 months had dropped out again, it's a lot of logistics and administration to recruit people and get them onboarded and offboarded. Even now that I have a system in place and an assistant to help me with on and offboarding, you know, it used to take about 10, 15 minutes just to get a person onboarded, the contract sent to, calendar invite added, etc. So what I now say is, I want your intention to be to come for a year, but I'm only going to make you commit to 3 months, right? So if the intention is for a year, then you invite people who really want supervision long-term and they want a group long-term, you know, and only if it really doesn't work for them, they would leave and they say, this really doesn't work for me, you know, but I gave it a good shot. Anything else in administration, I wonder? I think I said quite a few things already. Yeah, let's leave it there. If anything else comes up, make a note. We'll get back to it later. Fees, always a difficult question in any coaching or supervision. Look, you decide what you think it's worth, right? There's a whole list. I have a blog post on how much to charge for coaching. I made a list at some point of like 7, 8, 9 bullet points of things that I think should come into you charging fees and how much you charge, you know, including how much you've invested in this yourself, your level of experience, what you think your time is worth, what you can say without gagging, as my colleague Caroline Freya-Jones says, right? Something that you can say confidently. At some point, I put all my prices up. I didn't put the prices for the supervision groups up because I wanted supervision to be an affordable thing. And while I put the prices up for one-to-one quite considerably, I left those at the same. Mine are £80 a month. You know, I've seen 60 work quite well. I've seen 40 work. I've seen more work, depending on the size of the group, depending on what you bring to the group, depending on what people get out of the group. In the beginning, I had groups, I still have groups that have a business building element, right? So again, a decision is to, well, what is supervision for you? Traditional supervision group is you bring a client that you currently work with, and we dig into that. Right? There's a restorative, a formative, and a normative function to supervision. In my view, supervision can go a lot beyond that. As far as I'm concerned, whatever concerns you as a coach, you could bring to supervision. If it affects you, and if it means you had a horrible fight with your partner, with your child, or with a friend, or with a teacher, with another coach, if that's affecting your work in some way, I think it's relevant to bring into a supervision space. Right, so there's a debate whether business building is something to talk in a supervision group, because what can happen is that it becomes a business building group, because that's what most coaches, especially as they're starting out, are concerned about. So there's an important decision to make as a supervisor, whether you allow business building conversations, you know, how do I sign up clients, etc., marketing, where do I take my business, if you allow that into your space. So in the beginning, those groups where that was specifically agreed would be part of the group within balance, right? I would charge more for that because I felt business building would be an immediate return on investment, right? Because there was a mentoring element as well. So I felt I could charge more for that, and people were happy to pay that. At some point, I realized they all kind of mixed. They all became rocket supervision groups. You know, and in most of my groups, there is some balance, right? And it's okay with the group members, if it's okay with them, right? So we contract for that. If it's okay to bring in the occasional business building thing, then that's absolutely fine. I recently had a group of supervision of supervisors, where we agreed that one person stopped supervising and coaching, but the group worked so well together that the group decided, let's leave this person in the group. Let's offer this person to stay in the group, and let's consider this self-supervision, you know, because we're thinking really well together. So let's see how that goes, because now there might not be any coaching scenarios or supervision scenarios in the group from this person, you know. But if people are happy to help each other and create a space where we can reflect and think, fine. So as long as you agree that with the group and the group is happy with it, good. You know, if the group gets a bit bigger, it can get a bit messy. So sometimes it's better to, especially in the beginning, to start more authoritative, something that Nick Bolton often said when he was training, right? Start with a bit more authority and a clearer structure, and then loosen it up. And after a year, you have people come together that work quite well. You don't need to hold structure so much. It became second nature. But in the beginning, it really helps also for safety and comfort to have a clear process and hold that process, and you'll facilitate that process. Be clear on time, be clear on roles. You know, how does this work? At what point are we going to move on? How much time does everybody have? You know, and then you can lean back a bit more and just let the group do their work. Make sense? Cool. I put payments in there as well because it got a bit tedious at some point. It's easy to forget relatively low payment of like 60, 80 pounds a month. And then if you're like me and you're not particularly good with your accounts, all of a sudden you realize, oh, there's like a lot outstanding, and then you have to write a lot of emails, and that can be a bit awkward. right? So anything that automates payments is a good idea, I think. It helps people and it helps you, and think about how that might work. Maybe you say, well, you pay in advance for a year, and then once a year you renew. Maybe there's a system where they pay monthly and you just turn supervision on, and then when they leave the group, you turn supervision off. The way my booking system worked is I had to time limit it in some way. So I offered group memberships, and I still do, for a year. And after a year, they have to renew, right? And it's sometimes I wish I would just keep it going, because some people might not have left the group for a couple of months or years longer. But I think it's actually quite good to review after a year. How's it been going? And do you really want to continue? So I like that. We talked about that. Generally, expectations are a good thing to check in. So I want, in my pre-conversation, I check in, what's your experience with supervision? What are you expecting from the group? And in that first session, I want to have that again as a group, right? So tell each other your story, right? What kind of coach are you? What would you like from this group? What are you expecting from the group? What do I expect from you as a group member? What are our roles here? What are you concerned about? What are your hopes? What are your dreams for this group? What do you have any? Does anybody have any quirks that they need to know? The group to know about, right? Does anybody, sometimes I say a bit funnily, but does anybody twitches weirdly when the color green comes up, or when somebody wears the color something? You in groups. Sometimes you have people that say, oh, I'm not good with groups, or I usually lean back, or I usually jump in, but it's the defense mechanisms. They're all coaches. They tend to know a lot about themselves. So, and they might be different in one-to-one than in a group. So groups can really be quite triggering, especially if they don't know each other. So it's helpful to check into that well in the first session, really form. In the beginning, I really tried to put a slot of supervision in. Now I don't mind if the whole first session is us forming as a group. In my experience, is always worth it, because the better our relationship, the more we learn together. So rather than try to fit, half-hour slot of value in this, it was a better experience for me if you just allow the contracting to take as long as it needs to take, right? And there's no shame in having a checklist somewhere. I used a checklist for contracting for my groups for the first 2 years or so, right? Check the next 2-3 dates. How do we use any communication outside? I run a WhatsApp group for all my supervision groups. And I say, I'm not a leader of this WhatsApp group, but it's an open line of communication. So most groups don't really use that, but I think it's appreciated that it's there. So occasionally there's just logistics. Hey, I can't make the next session. Would you be available the week after or the week before? My general rule is, if we don't find a new slot for this group relatively easily with like 2-3 tries, maybe you're just going to have to sit this month out, right? But I was surprised at how easy it is usually to find a new date when you're all in the same room together. Right? Via WhatsApp, a bit more difficult. Via email, even more difficult. So WhatsApp group, do you want run or do you not? Because it can also offer and open up more complexity. Once I opened up a WhatsApp group with a new group, and one of the members immediately bombarded the group with stuff, with valuable resources, right? Before they even knew each other. It was a really difficult experience because they don't know how to deal with that yet. They're just checking each other out. And we hadn't had a conversation about how we're using WhatsApp. I don't want anybody to feel excluded. Some people might not even use WhatsApp, or, oh my God, not another WhatsApp group that I have to monitor, right? So I check in with that in the first session. Hey, there is a space. In my experience, it works well. How do you feel about WhatsApp? Are you the, oh my God, another WhatsApp group person? Or would you be quite helpful with this? And then generally the contract is around, well, let's see how it goes and let's see what activity there is. And if there was any activity, let's check in next time we meet. How did that work? What was it like? What's important to me is that, there isn't a lot of stuff happening that someone feels excluded about. So it might be easier to just not have a group outside. You know, external communication, some of these group members might have a relationship with each other. They might train together. They might see each other in a local community. There might be some chatter outside. Once I had a group where I felt there were two people chatting to each other while the group was taking place with a private chat function. You know, that kind of thing, that's not helpful, you know, and it wasn't quite obvious as well. So also that includes when you talk to someone outside of the group. Ideally, all the communication takes in within the group, but occasionally there's something they don't want to share with you, right? Oh, I'm thinking about leaving the group because that person is just really so annoying. Every time I have to just sit on my hands to not want to shake them. You know, they might not want to say that in front of that person. I would appreciate it. I think it would be a lot more teachable. There's a lot more learning potential in it, but they might not want to, and that's okay. Right. So sometimes I have conversations with people outside of the group. I try to minimize that. But that's something to think about, right? What's your policy around that? Good. Checking in, super important. I always make some time at the end. Often just ask a general question like, what could we do more of, less of, differently here? What's your experience of being in this space? But what helps is to just pick specific moments. For example, I might say something like, I felt I interrupted such and such a lot today, or I felt today was like a lot speedier than usual. How did you experience that? You know, or you've been silent today. You know, I haven't heard much from you. Like, just wanted to check in. Are you okay? So anything like that, it just invites people to pick up specific moments. Any specific moments from you that you've noticed today? You know, so it helps if you throw an example in, and over time, people get the recontracting stage because the contract is always evolving. Good. We have an hour, Shabir, right?
We have 45 minutes
Okay. 45 minutes?
left.
45 minutes left, so we have an hour and a half. Great, fantastic.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. I mentioned structure for a bit, right? So there's a ton of different ways in which you can run groups. I like the format that I run for all of my groups. It's a pretty open conversation. That's, you know, illustrative of my coaching style as well. I like to tune in with what's in front of me. And within the structure of, we have those 2 slots. And in the very first session, you would ask, well, who would like to bring something? And then usually with 4 members in the group, the next session, 2 will have presented last time. So the 2 that didn't have dibs. You know, if they didn't want to bring anything and they wanted to pass on their slot, you can ask. So I would just ask, you know, who's got something to bring? And if it's 1, then we start with that person. If it's 2, perfect. If it's more than 2, we make a decision together who we start with. You know, that's been fine. But there's a lot of different ways. Then that person is presenting, right? So they just give us context. They might tell us what kind of lens they want us to put on. They might tell us if there is a specific endpoint or a particular question they want to answer, a particular way forward they want to reach. Maybe we just agree that they just get to talk about their client and we see what happens. So whatever contract that is, from SMART goal to fully exploratory, as long as you agree, then that's what we're going to do today, right? So everybody else who's not in the spotlight, who's not presenting, is just there to support that person with their questions, their observations, maybe a piece of advice if that is invited or appropriate, right? So contract around what the role of each person is and how this session is going to go, not necessarily where it's going to go, but as much as you could in a coaching session as well. You know, what's your style? What's your approach? What do people think about that? So the more you agree on what kind of structure and process you're using, then it'll be a smooth session, right? So there's structures like, for example, a bail-in session where somebody would present for 5 minutes, and then there's a round of clarifying questions. And then at some point, the person turns the camera off and or in a physical space, switches, like turns around, turns the chair around, goes on mute, on online, goes on mute, turn the camera off, and then the other people share what they think about what's happening here for them. And that person is forced, so to speak, just to listen to this and take it all in. And then at some point they come back after, what, 10 minutes, and they share their reflections. That's just one of many, many, many group processes that you could apply in a supervision group. I'm not going to go into different processes because there's other sessions on that, and there's just way too many. I have some of those in my bag, and very occasionally in a group I pull it out if it feels like that would be really helpful, right? If there's a coach who's continuously just in their own way, it might be really helpful to do a balance session and have them just forced to take it all in and really listen, you know, without themselves just jumping in all the time. But generally, I just have conversations amongst the group where everybody's focused on helping that person out with their questions, their observations, their reflections, their curiosity, right? Or their advice, their experience. As long as your members are clear on what their role is, it's all good, right? I see myself as one of the coaches in the room. Yes, I have a special role in terms of facilitation, but I always try to meet all of my clients at eye level, and that includes coaches. And even if the coach is just starting out, we're just, you know, 5 human beings in the room. And I have a certain role, and I have some roles that you do not have. But like, what's your role? In the beginning, I just started with, I sometimes tell coaches, well, in the beginning, I might take a bit of a lead in the supervision process, you know, but like, if I don't hear from you, I'll probably get really curious about what you think. So then I would stop at certain points and say, what do others think? You know, who's got an observation, a comment, a question, something that could help this person in the spotlight right now? And if you agree that beforehand, they know they get their place to speak. And if they've been quiet, then I'm probably curious. I'm not going to make them speak if they don't have anything to say, but you know, they have a place to speak. So everybody feels safe in knowing what their role is and how they can contribute. Make sense? Cool. Oh yes, it's it's tricky when in groups when people are late. And I often joke that I've married into a Mexican family, and that my relationship with punctuality has, well, evolved depending on what kind of cultural circles you're in. When people come online or into a physical space, and there's 3 out of 4 people are there, and the 4th one is not there, somebody's going to ask, how are you? And I want everybody to be there when people answer that question, right? So I always do a check-in in the beginning. It's just like, what's present for you right now? How are you, basically? How are you doing? How are you being? But I want people to be there and hear it so that we're all checked in together. So it's really important to me that people turn up on time. It's not always possible. Sometimes things happen, but it's something to contract about and make a point about in the beginning, so that everybody tries really hard to be there, because it is disruptive to the dynamics. And then you're just like, what could we talk about that is not checking in, you know? And sometimes that's easy. Sometimes just like, oh, have you heard about what's going on with BetterUp? Or have you heard about this coaching thing in the news? Or I read this interesting article recently, or I went on a training. And you can talk about something that's helpful, but it's not starting the supervision session in a way, right? But it's disruptive when you're not in time. So that I found a challenge. And yeah, now I contract quite clearly about it without being too much of a punctuality Nazi. Another question I've asked is, should I nudge groups that the session is starting? You know, Google Calendar can send out an invite. My one-to-one clients always get an invite from the booking system. I mentioned that my booking system is not able to book the groups in like I want to. So my clients always get a 3-day reminder, and I think a 3-hour reminder. And very few people miss sessions. Sometimes I have a hunch to put something in the WhatsApp group and say, hey, looking forward to seeing you later. But after a dozen groups, it's just no longer really feasible. Sometimes I have a hunch and I follow that. You know, sometimes I had a weird hunch and I didn't do it, and somebody didn't turn up, and I'm like, interesting. Well, whatever I picked up there. Maybe it's just random coincidence, but maybe not. I don't know. But that's a decision to make, right? Do I send a reminder out or do I not? I like personal responsibility generally as an existentialist. You know, there's a lot around, well, you take responsibility, but I don't mind sitting there waiting for a one-to-one client and just breathing until they show up. I don't mind. But if there's a group involved and everybody's waiting, it doesn't work quite the same way. Also, super important, closure endings. I used to, in the beginning, have get a text message half an hour before the session started and say, hey, I won't be able to make it today. And also, I decided to stop supervision. Thank you so much. It's been so great. I've learned so much. Really appreciate the space. And then we're like, okay. Huh. And then we're all there. And okay, this person is no longer part of the group. It's weird, right? It doesn't have to be, but there's something that is not really ending. Was it something I said last time? Or did they not get what they want? Were they just being polite? Is there something that we could have learned? Also, I would have wanted to tell this person still a bunch of things, you know, about appreciating them. So I contract that whenever you want to leave the group, absolutely fine. Just let me know and come to one more session. And that works most of the time. Occasionally, it's more complex because they can't make the next session. And then maybe I would want to invite somebody else in, but, you know, I still want to close. So I might say something like, could you just tune in for 5-10 minutes at the end, or 5-10 minutes at the beginning? You know, just so we can say a round of goodbyes and just have this and close well, right? I won't charge you for that session. No worries. Just, you know, let's close well. So if it really doesn't work, it usually can make it work. And that worked quite well, just on a practical level. But yes, endings are super important, I think. And I now have that as a solid part of what I agree with people. Sometimes it can drift into something that I don't think is supervision anymore. So I've had some supervision groups that they became so acquainted with each other, you know, they became friends in a way. And then I don't really have a client to bring today. I would just love to talk about this thing, this common theme in coaching, or, you know, then all of a sudden it could, not all of a sudden, but gradually, you know, it could drift into something that you feel maybe this is no longer supervision. How do you manage that? Have you caught something early when it started? And as part of the check-in, you're like, what was this today? Was this still supervision? How did you feel about that? I wasn't really feeling that we did any work today. You know, this felt a bit more like a chat. How do you experience it? You know, if it's been 2-3 times that people really didn't bring, so, well, everything is kind of going well. I am the first one to encourage every coach to coming to supervision, come regularly. Right? That's why my groups are monthly and not quarterly. I think it's important that you bring your clients to supervision, not physically, obviously, but like you discuss your work, whether your work is going well or it's tricky. The reality is that most people come to supervision when they have a client that they're stuck with, that is difficult, where they don't know what to do. Some of my best learnings I had when I didn't know what to bring, and I just looked at the last session that I did. And some of the best sessions I've had with people was exactly that. I always laugh now when I hear, oh, I just got a small thing. It probably will be over very quickly. I'm thinking, yeah, let's see. And it's always a full half hour, and we could have probably dove into a little bit longer. So there's always learning, regardless of whether good goes good or not so good. So when you start drifting into chats, maybe you can catch this, and maybe you can contract for, you know, we don't have to have a chat. We can just look at your most recent session. You know, who did you coach yesterday or last week or this morning? You know, why don't we just look at that? Talked about that. Micro breaches. Well, it can start very subtly that your contract kind of gets a bit breached, right? You're gonna make a big deal out of it if somebody is a minute late or 2. You know, at what point would you say, it'd be really great if we could make an effort next time? You know, because I had that awkward moment where, you know, it felt like you're telling them off. And for some people, 2 minutes is it's not late. It just doesn't even occur to them that somebody could think that that's late. So maybe you have, or maybe you haven't contracted clearly around that in the beginning. But like, are you really going to say something when it's a minute? But then what it's 2, where's the threshold? So same thing with like, well, interruptions or challenges, criticism, you know, something that kind of goes against what you had contracted, but not enough for you to really say something. In groups, I would be very careful with that and rather acknowledge it early and be really transparent about it. It's like, feel a bit ridiculous to bring this up, to be honest. But, you know, when you came in a minute after the hour, you know, we were there, and it was only just a moment where we thought, is he going to show up or not? You know, is she going to join us? What are we talking about now? Even I feel a bit silly just bringing it up, but experience tells me that maybe better bring it up before than not. If you're transparent like that and share that, you know, this doesn't really feel significant at all, but also experience teaches you that it could get significant if it's not caught early. So I figured I'd just put it on the table and see what you guys think. Yeah. And as I'm saying, guys, you know, inclusive language, that became a big topic, right? I say guys all the time. And there was a group, much larger group, alumni group of a course I was doing, that really challenged me on guys. Somebody had, well, not me directly, but somebody had shared an article about how this company was changing their language and stopped using the term guys. And for me, it's inclusive, right? I haven't met anybody. I've 2 of that very large group said, actually, it doesn't feel fully, they're not that they feel excluded per se, because usually it's not said with that intention, but there is something around it. So up until that point, I had never met anybody who actually had an issue with it, you know, but then just because you haven't met anybody doesn't necessarily mean that somebody isn't. You know, in a group of 4, it's easy to have that conversation, and hopefully people will speak up if they would like to ask you to use more inclusive language, or if they didn't quite feel included by some terminology that you're using. So helpful to check in with that. If you know there's a term that might be considered, you know, challenging or non-inclusive, or even just in general, right? Check into language. So that's helpful. Right. Sometimes we might need to manage egos and other identity needs. When groups come together, some people take more space, some people lean back more, some can be quite challenging characters. Some might come in with huge triggers of their previous experiences in groups. And again, it's helpful to have that conversation about you in groups before, but whenever you pick up that there's some interesting dynamics forming, it's helpful to check into that. And I know not every coach might feel confident or comfortable to either pick it up or then have a conversation about it or even work with it. But it's even if you can't name it, even if you can't correctly label it in psychodynamic language, it's helpful to just say, there was something interesting going on today, and I just wanted to put it on the table to see whether we can learn something from it. Right? Part of my contract is, hey, we also learn from our dynamics within this group. Chances are that some of what's happening here in this group is showing up outside of the group. So if somebody's bringing in a huge ego, chances are they have a huge ego outside of this room too. You know, somebody who's really holding back, not just humble, but like really not engaging. Chances are they show up outside of that group too, maybe in other groups or maybe not. But when you start picking up on these kind of dynamics and different needs from people, you have a better group, and also you have a chance of learning from these parallel processes. And talking about parallel processes, I love working with groups for that reason, right? Because something that's happening here in this group that usually doesn't happen in this group is often a sign that this is being picked up from whatever that coach is bringing into the room, right? So we were sitting in a group recently. Yeah, I want, long story short, somebody asked a question to somebody else in the group, and then I jumped in, sort of rescuing that person from a difficult question. And then somebody else in the group was like, oh, but like, wasn't that question asked to her? And I'm like, oh, that's super interesting. I don't usually do that. I don't usually jump in to protect people from difficult questions. Yes, I had something to say around that question, and there was something from earlier that I did want to say, but I don't really do that. That's interesting. Where is that coming from? And that same dynamic was present in that person that asked me the question, that person that just presented a case, you know, because the person that they were coaching took this victim role, and the coach had taken this this protector role. And that same dynamic showed up with me protecting that other coach. So we were able to recognize that. So sometimes what's going on for the coach can be picked up on what's going on for the group. And that's more challenging work, right? So I'd encourage you to read into psychodynamic literature, parallel processes, really interesting stuff going on, huge opportunities to learn. If you miss it, there's always something you miss, right? So don't worry about it. There's so many things you're missing every single second in a group. There's so much going on. If you're just present, pick up on what you can, be curious, don't put pressure on you to name everything and be in charge of everything. The group is going to evolve into what the group is going to evolve. If you try to control it too much, it's not going to be helpful. If you don't step in and put some structure, the group might get very messy. So there's an intricate balance of holding the group, but also giving them space. There can be dual relationships, right? So I mentioned some coaches might know each other. You might have worked with someone one-to-one, and then they're entering a group. You know, so I had a few people in groups just keep referencing our one-to-one work, which is a bit awkward for the rest of the group. You know, so that kind of needs to be acknowledged and managed in some way. You don't want to have favorite people in the group. You know, you might catch yourself having that. You know, you might like some people more than not. But like in coaching, there's dual relationships can be difficult, right? If you coach somebody from within your organization or you coach a friend, there's a dual relationship. It makes things more complicated. Same in groups. You know, if you bring 4 coaches together that don't know each other, it's easier. But, you know, it might not be possible. And also, it can really help. You know, 2 coaches already know each other, or 3. If you invite a new coach into the group, for example, then, you know, they already know each other. It can be really helpful. They're coming into an established, trusting vibe. It can really help the group. It can also feel difficult. So that, as a supervisor, you need to manage. Same in group coaching. You also need to manage that. Right. I got a couple of more left before we can open the floor for questions. Conflict is inevitable. I wish people would storm a little bit more. There's this concept of how groups form, right? Storming, forming. First they form, right? Then they storm. They have some conflict. They kind of check each other out, and they have differences in opinion. At some point, they norm, and then they perform. I forgot the people's name who came up with that. Maybe somebody can put it in the chat. But that's normal for groups. And I'm wary of groups that don't have this storming phase, or I haven't picked up on it. It can be subtle. Storming can be very subtle. It can be some slight intellectual challenge, perhaps, or, you know, some looks. But ideally, you would create a space for that. Not that you're encouraging people fighting with each other, but some form of conflict and disagreement is really helpful, right? Because once you get through that, once things are being said and not said, the group works better together. So some groups get a bit stuck because they never really get a place to kind of argue with each other a bit. So in therapy groups, that's really it's so much more common that there's some disagreement and some conflict, because, you know, generally there's people in more vulnerable spaces, maybe not as developed in terms of defense mechanisms or overdeveloped with defense mechanisms. But really with coaching groups, especially in the UK, very polite to each other. I almost want to not stoke conflict, but I want to, whenever I notice something, I want to pay attention to it and maybe create a space where these things can be voiced not so subtly, but more clearly. Do you know what I mean? Okay, good. That's kind of all the points on my list. Maybe I forgot a few, but I'm super curious to see what you think. And maybe let's do it like this. I'll show you this one. This is where you can get your certificate of attendance because the formal part of the session is over. So, and Shabir, maybe you can put that in the chat as well if you haven't already done so.
Putting in the chat, and I have also dropped you the questions from chat. If you can answer those questions.
Beautiful. Perfect. I'll leave that there for a moment. If you wanted to kind of stay in touch, I do write and talk about these things, and I love talking about coaching supervision. So always like to hear from people. So I'll leave that up for a few moments, and yeah, really curious what your experience is, what else you're curious about. If you have more questions, we have another 20 minutes. Have an eye on the chat as well. Ooh, there's quite a bit. Ah, you already copied some questions in there. Ah, great. I see.
Yeah.
Do people want to ask these questions directly? Then we can have a bit more of a conversation. That'd be nice. I think the duration one I've already answered. Oh, that was Rebecca, right? Rebecca, is that enough? Have I answered that? Do you want to know more?
No, perfect. You did answer that one. I did have a question in the chat around non-attendance and late cancellations. So you spoke obviously about lateness, but what do you do if people don't show up or they notify you at the very last minute that they're unable to attend? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, these things happen, right? So I always encourage them to speak directly to the group. You know, occasionally that doesn't happen. In that case, if I have a message, then I'll just relay the message, right? Such and such couldn't join us. They said they're really sad. If they gave us a reason and they were happy for me to share the reason, I'm not going to assume that if they wrote me a private message that maybe they didn't want other people to know. So, you know, person couldn't join us. And then, yeah, when we're at the end of the group, we agree on when to meet next, just to make sure that you still keep that person included, right? So if someone's not there, I just acknowledge it, right? Obviously, such and such couldn't be with you today. I still feel she's in the room, right? Sometimes they say, well, I wonder what such and such will think about this right now. You know, so we keep her or him or them alive in the group, even when they're not present. Very occasionally, we have found practical solutions like when, for example, once a person really wanted to join the group, but then they couldn't make it because of a medical emergency. They couldn't make it to the introductory session. So we agreed with the group that we would record the introductions and the contracting, but not the supervision bit. So, and that person who couldn't join would then record a video into the WhatsApp group introducing themselves, having watched a recording of the others, you know, and then we check in the next session around, is there anything they wanted to add to the contract, right? So even with that kind of critical moment of like, we want to make a start, we're all lined up. What do we do if one person can't make it? Maybe recording it and then deleting it was a really good practical solution to what was before a real dilemma.
And Yannick, sorry, linked to that, what happens if you have to cancel because you're ill in terms of the fee?
Good question.
Do you offer an additional free session? Do you refund? What do you do?
Yeah. So if I have to cancel, I give everybody a refund. And if, for example, if I'm on holiday, like I don't think I've been ill for a session. I think I should probably also be allowed to be ill, but also, I don't know, for me, it kind of feels odd. If it's me, I feel I should give them a refund. And if it's them who can't, maybe they need to miss a session for whatever reason, then holiday or whatever happens, I can't fill their slot, right? So I also make it clear that there's no refunds. This is a monthly membership fee. This is not a fee for that particular session, right? And because I can't replace your slot, then there's no refunds on individual sessions. And so far, everybody's accepted that. Occasionally, people don't. I have a relatively lengthy contract. It's like 3 pages for groups, and I didn't have that before. And at some point, I learned it's better to be on the same page together, right? So now I actually say exactly like that, right? I'm like, my contract is a bit too long for my own taste, but experience taught me it's better to be on the same page, literally, with some of the ground rules. And usually in one-to-one, I say, hey, this document is not set in stone. If you want to change or amend any parts of the contract, we can talk about it. In groups, I don't do that because everybody has the same contract. Everybody agrees to the same ground rules, right? So, and yeah, cancellation and payments and, missing sessions, that's part of that. What else? I'll also just put this in here.
Hey, Yannick, can I ask a question? It's Chris.
Absolutely, Chris. Good to
Great.
hear your voice again.
Yeah, likewise, mate. It's good to see you. If you're so willing and, with confidentiality and respect in mind, would you mind sharing with us, one of your most or more challenging moments you've had during the supervision group?
Yeah.
You responded.
Yeah, I briefly mentioned that guy who joined the group and immediately just put a bunch of content into the WhatsApp group before they had even met. It got a lot worse from there. I had known that person from before, so I felt experience-wise, they were all very experienced coaches. It was him and then 3 somewhat older ladies, right? So in their 40s and 50s, he was in his kind of mid-late 30s. And that was challenging because he brought a lot of stuff, just from how he's grown up, really challenging experiences. In one-to-one, his relationship with groups hadn't come out, right? Because this was about one-to-one coaching, supervision, and I just didn't have an awareness of how he's showing up in groups. So I figured, yeah, that worked quite well. I probably made some decisions a bit too quickly. I really wanted to get the group going. I kind of rushed it a little bit. There was something that complained, intuition-wise, but I'm like, let's get it going. And I wish I wouldn't have done that because it was a catastrophe. That person immediately created this in-group, out-group dynamic. And we debriefed on it afterwards, and it was just, he knew where it was coming from, but he just couldn't help it. Almost every statement that he's made was either to get me on his side and could kind of sit closer to me in a way, or to just kind of, it was as if he was trying to create a divide between him and the rest of the group. So it was really, really disruptive. And then, I don't know, it was just odd dynamics, and we kind of talked about it, but that it didn't work, right? It didn't get better. So we, after the second session, fortunately, everybody was pretty clear that this is not a good idea, right? So then that person made the decision that I don't think this works, right? I think I bit off more than I can chew, and being in this group, I mean, being in a group in general is already difficult for me, but I thought I could make it work, but I can't. So fortunately, that person, why does unfortunately, what would Freud think about that? But yes, fortunately, that person decided to leave, and I didn't have to intervene and say, look, I think you need to leave, because that would have been a massive blow to this person and would have been not just ruptured that relationship, but be potentially really harmful and opened up a bunch of trauma that I didn't know was there in connection with groups. So yeah, it reminded me of really listening to that instinct, and because there was something there, I took that to supervision. And I'm like, there was signs that maybe I should check into this a little bit more.
Thanks. Off the back of that, Yannick, do you then suggest or recommend, or indeed do you have any practice for collecting groups of similar I hate to use this dehumanizing term, but avatar? Do you have like do you tend to group people together as age or in terms of interest or anything like that?
So it's the three things that I mentioned earlier, right? Roughly experience, and this is like very new to coaching, sort of between 100 and 300 hours of experience, 400, and then anything above 500, between 300 and 900 coaching hours, whatever that means, right? Over whatever period of time. But coaching hours better than years of experience in my experience. And I have some groups that are 1,000 plus, right? So yeah, so the categories are really new, over 100 hours, and then between 3 and 5, 6, 7, and then over 1,000 is another kind of category. But yes, so experience. What do you want from a supervision group? Would you be okay with a business building element occasionally if we, keep it relatively balanced? Maybe you just want a business building group. That's okay too. I've once ran just a pure business building group. It just happened. We didn't start out like that, but it turns out that everybody really needed that. So okay. Yeah, logistics. Can you make the slot? Otherwise, I like diversity, right? So, but if somebody wants other positive psychologists in the group, it can be really helpful because you can have a different kind of conversation. It might be really helpful to put a Gestalt coach, positive psychology coach, psychodynamic coach, and a narrative coach in the same room together. They're going to learn so much from each other. It's going to be amazing. Or they feel it's not really serving them because they really would like to deepen their practice and maybe not get challenged on some of their assumptions. So it's a bit more complex when it's a very diverse group. I think the potentiality for learning is higher, but it's also more complex. So it might be easier in the beginning to have people really aligned with who they are and what they want. So if you bring for example, if you bring 4 highly sensitive coaches together, they're going to be really aligned on that level. If you bring 4 coaches who are super extrovert and work with leaders in a particular industry of business, that's going to feel really aligned. So yeah, it's not better or worse, I think.
Well, thanks for that. And also thanks for this session is really useful.
Great. Joanna.
Hi.
Hey.
So I facilitate reflective practice groups, which feels very similar to group supervision. There are often people who work together, who might work together in the same team, and it feels helpful to draw attention to group dynamics and what is going on in the space. So I suppose my question is, in a group supervision space for coaches where they're not working together outside of that group, how much your role is to draw attention, make observations about the group dynamics?
Yeah, I think every coach needs to decide that. Every supervisor needs to decide that, right? It's really a matter of style and what you contract around that. I think there's a huge playing field in the helping by talking universe, right? So some supervisors might not work with any dynamics, and it's really just about what's the process of coaching, much more formative. Others that just hold space, really person-centered, and just not intervene, really trusting that person knows best and just hold space for them, right? Creating more of a thinking environment. So I don't think there's a better or worse coach. There's better or worse matches or fit, and that comes out even more in groups. So you decide what your style is, and I think as long as you can reasonably communicate what your style is, what you do and don't do, what you can and cannot offer in a group, and what you will and will not offer to a group, then people can give you informed consent on that basis, right? So do we need to open the existential doors into your relationship with death and endings? Well, it might be helpful, but it might also not be useful at all. I have an eye for that, but I might not put it on the table. But like part of that is my lens, and you might hear me ask bigger questions or wanting to go into more depth than perhaps another supervisor. I might be more challenging than another supervisor who might be a bit more supportive, you know, a bit more gentle. I can be gentle when it's required, but like my modus operandi is exploring and challenging. So you need to decide what your style is and then be able to communicate that so that people can agree to it. That's how I see it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I suppose there's also something about whether it's relevant to what the person is bringing to discuss. So if it is something about how they relate to other people and it's something that's being reflected in the group, then it may be helpful to raise it or ask questions around it.
Yeah, and you can contract in these moments, right? It's like, there's a question that's on my mind, but I'm not quite sure if it's appropriate to ask because we haven't really asked those kind of questions in this group before. So maybe I'll just put it out there and you tell me whether that's a helpful question and you kind of want to go there. Or maybe a different question would be more helpful. Or maybe how about we all prepare a question, then we hit enter in the chat on 3 and then you pick one. You know, I had groups where I said, okay, so let's pause. And now everybody asks a question and then that person decides whether they want to answer any of them or none of them or just pick any. And then ultimately your supervisee, ultimately your client decides, I think.
I like that.
Julie.
Thank you.
Hi there. Just following on a little bit from what you were talking about earlier, I'm interested in how you manage conflict in a group when there's kind of an obvious undertone of potentially somebody that, you know, that's maybe rubbing up other people in the group the wrong way. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about how you manage that, please.
Yeah. So acknowledgement is, I think, the key, first of all, the acknowledgement and not judging it, right? So keep it descriptive and try not to interpret what's going on here, right? So an undertone is a difficult one to acknowledge in a way, right? This seems to be rubbing people the wrong way. Not a helpful thing to say maybe, but it's like, I don't know, there's something in your voice that is usually not there. And I'm curious about that, you know, or something just changed. Can you feel that too? What is that? What's going on for people? You know, or, wow, I'm not sure about others, but I just found myself getting a bit defensive, you know, after hearing this. Does anybody resonate with that? You know, Robin Showett, for example, works beautifully with just what's going on for himself. You know, if I have already made a decision that I'm not getting defensive because this person reminds me of, you know, that bully in high school or so, but actually I'm getting a bit defensive because something is being created in this space right now. Oh, there's a ladybug crawling around my camera. So if it like crawls in front of it, that's why. So you can address, like, describe what you're experiencing or describe what you're picking up in front of you, and then let the group make sense of this together. Sometimes it's helpful to name something. I'm like, wow, I'm not sure about you, but that felt a bit aggressive, you know, or, oh, there's something in there. Is there something you're not telling us? I wonder, you know, I get a sense that there's more that you want to say. Like all of these things, they invite someone to say what they really mean if there's an undertone, you know, to bring it out so you can invite it into the space without, you know, throwing gasoline on the fire or making somebody feel really weird about it. Because I also don't want to single out the person that did that, because they did that for a reason. Every time I try to get curious rather than defensive or awkward, right? It's like, what is this? And if you meet something that has a potential for conflict with curiosity, well held within the contract of the group, then you can work with this really constructively. But it can also feel bold, you know, because you don't know what you're going to be opening up when you say, I feel there's more that you want to say, or I feel there's something you're not telling us. I might be wrong, but like, it's just a sense that I have. What do you think? And they might say what they really mean, and they might really have a problem with something that the other person might say. Or even worse, they might have a problem with who that person is. It might not be very constructive what comes out of them. And that's a fantastic learning experience, again, opportunity for that person, but it can also be really difficult to hold that kind of space. But if you don't acknowledge it, it will come back, right? So I think it's always better to acknowledge these kind of budding conflicts, as long as they're not conflicts yet. You know, as long as the emotions are not high. If somebody holds back for like 5 sessions, but really feel that this person is just, you know, not practicing ethically, or just, how dare you do what you do, but they don't feel it's their space to say it. If it comes out 5 sessions later, it's going to come out in a very different way, right? So the earlier you can catch these kind of things, the better.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, Julia.
Again, so I'm disappearing into the darkness. I do apologize. Mine is a kind of follow-on. So I was thinking similarly beforehand, from group dynamics I've been in, where the unspoken thing or sometimes challenge thing can be due to inclusion. So either if you know, privileges that may be in the room, or prejudices that may be present in us as individuals. My focus is neurodivergence. So again, so assumptions about communication styles and things like that. So I've also been in groups where once that's raised, then the group has really struggled to stay together. So how to handle raising something that can be so challenging for individuals to consider working with.
Yeah, what's really powerful in my experience is to really focus in on the common ground. You know, why are we here together? And with coaching groups where there's a clear goal for the team, for example, that's much more clear because they're working on something together, and they can park a lot of their differences because they're working towards a common goal. With supervision groups, a bit more complex, right? Because they don't tend to work towards a common goal unless they're all they're all coaches who work in the same organization or with the same team or something like that. But if you throw 4 random coaches into a group, and those individual differences or neurodiversity comes into play, right? We're all different, but you could argue that someone who's got ADHD or autism maybe is a little bit more different than if you're just an introvert and an extrovert. So I think it's important to appreciate that and to acknowledge it, and not to be afraid of our differences, but really see what do we have in common. And when there's a bit of an in-group, out-group going on, acknowledge that kind of dynamic and see, is it in the way? Is it going to be helpful? Like, how's it being managed? You know, are we still working constructively together, or is this now something that is in the way? And in my experience, if you facilitate a conversation around that, and maybe today we don't have 2 slots, maybe we only have 1, or if we need to, we don't. You know, the group working well together is always priority over talking about one individual client. You know, because if you don't, if that gets out of hand, if that derails, then it's not going to be a very productive session anyway. I mean, you can bracket it for some time, and then I'm sure in some supervision groups there's stuff going on and it's not acknowledged and it's not worked with, and everybody's just polite enough to just holding space for each other continuously. But I think we're missing out on some learning opportunities. You know, but then also I don't want to send the message that every coach or supervisor should be able to work with those kind of dynamics, because it's not everybody's style and not everybody has to. Right? There's plenty of coaches who don't really know much about psychology at all. That's okay. They do a different kind of style of coaching, you know, and they're in some ways limited to the quality, the depth of the work, right? But it doesn't mean that it's bad work. You know, every coaching approach has its place, and every supervisor has its place. And as long as you're a supervisor who's willing and committed to hold space for a group and facilitate the logistics, then okay, you might miss a bunch of dynamics, but chances are it might not explode in your face. Maybe occasionally it does, and then okay, what's the worst thing? The group stops.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Especially that it's actually a group that is working together, that are coaching and supporting other people. So that it can't necessarily fall apart, but that common ground, staying on the common ground seems a really good thing to refocus on. Thank you.
Mhm. I love that on my screen. It said the whole time, complex strength in the neurodiverse universe, raised hand. It feels very significant. Thank you. Oh, we're out of time. Well, in that case, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this, and you make the space, right? So I appreciate your curiosity, and I hope you run many groups. If I missed anything out, or you wake up tomorrow and you think about another question, feel free to email me or drop me a line. I'm always happy to talk about these things. All right. Bye.